it's Keith Miller again. Chapter 1 of our textbook was an introduction. Chapter 2 gets more into the meat of the course. In this chapter, we try to give you some intellectual tools for analyzing computer ethics and really any ethical issues. Think of this chapter as laying down some theory that you can apply to computer ethic problems in this chapter and then in the rest of the book. Those of you who are familiar with ethical theories will find that much of this chapter is a review, but there are several computer-related cases in Chapter 2, and hopefully that analysis will be new to everyone. I'll let you read the details of each of these theories in the textbook, so I'll try not to belabor the point here. Permit me, however, to include a few comments about each of the four main groups of theories listed in Chapter 2. A bumper sticker slogan for utilitarian ethics might be the greatest good for the greatest number. Notice that I've substituted good for the happiness that is emphasized in the book. A third characteristic thing that you want to maximize is utility. And that's another thing that's often discussed with respect to this ethical notion. That's in fact where the term utilitarian comes from. Two other categories of ethical thoughts are appropriate when we're talking about utilitarian: consequentialist and teleological. Don't let all these different names and flavors confuse you. As long as you remember that utilitarians emphasize consequences, you won't go too far astray. The next philosophical big ideas come from the deontologists. A bumper sticker for deontology might be respect all humans. Kant's categorical imperative can be stated as never treat a human merely as an end. And that merely is quite important in the statement as the textbook describes. The word deontology comes from the Greek, meaning the science of duties. Duties and obligations are important to deontologists, and professional ethics for IT professionals often is described in terms of duties to the public, duties to employers, and duties to users. Virtue ethics is perhaps the oldest of the formal philosophical ethical traditions, and historians of such things trace back virtue ethics at least back to Confucius. The Greeks Aristotle and Plato are also big names in virtue ethics. Excellent character and living up to your ideals are big ideas in virtue ethics. Deontology and utilitarian ideas used to be the most popular in applied ethics, but virtue ethics is becoming of increasing interest lately. The final big idea I'll mention is social contract theory, especially the variation traced to the modern philosopher John Rawls. Rawls wrote an influential book called The Theory of Justice, in which he used a clever thought experiment involving a magical veil of ignorance. Based on this experiment, he made a case for democratic rules and for a special rule about taking care for the least advantaged. I want to spend another minute or two on John Rawls' clever idea called the veil of ignorance. Rawls was trying to describe what he called the original position. He wanted to imagine that people could negotiate a truly just society, but only if they somehow, at least temporarily, could remove their own self-interests from the conversation. So Rawls made up this great little story. He's going to gather together all the people who are going to develop his rules for making a just society. But just before the debate begins, Rawls ushers all the participants into a room, making them pass through a magic curtain called the veil of ignorance. And as each person walks through that curtain, they instantly don't know who they are. They know everything else, but somehow they just can't recognize if they're rich or poor, male or female, what their nationality is, or what their profession is. Of course, this can only happen in a magical room, but it turns out to be quite a useful thought experiment to consider what kinds of decisions people would make if they didn't know who they would be when they walked out of the room. And yet, they had to follow those rules no matter what their eventual lot in life was. Once this thought experiment was set up, it's not surprising to me that Rawls predicted that people in his magical room would take special care for the least advantaged in their society, since each of the people in that room just might be that least advantaged person when they passed back through the veil of ignorance to learn who they really were. People have been thinking about ethics for thousands of years, and in a few minutes of lecture and a few pages of a textbook, we've thrown a lot of words at you about some very big and sometimes subtle ideas. But I hope we haven't confused you. Don't feel intimidated by these ideas. I want you to think of these theories as tools that you can apply to concrete practical problems that you encounter, both in this course, in your everyday life, and in your professional lives. With a little practice, you should be able to look at an ethical issue and go to your toolbox to pull out a theory or two that seems most appropriate. Often you can use more than one idea or tool on the same issue and then compare and contrast the insights you get by using each of the tools. One of my favorite notions from philosophy is the dialectic. Deborah Johnson is a master at this art. She has a knack for teasing apart ideas, challenging assumptions, and weaving new ideas from a collection of old ideas. The back and forth of a good dialectic has elements of a debate, but unlike the competitive, cutthroat nature of many debates, the dialectic is ideally a constructive and cooperative activity. You can do the dialectic inside your own head, but it is often more productive to engage in the dialectic as a group activity, where the people who are involved can both criticize and learn from other people's ideas. The people who are at best at this intellectual game called the dialectic enter with an open mind, but they do not easily surrender their own convictions. You can see the dialectic at work in the textbook discussion of the idea that all ethics is relative. First, we bring into play the difference between a normative and a descriptive claim. Taken as a description and not as a prescription, the phrase all ethics is relative seems to be a fairly obvious and somewhat innocuous claim. Yes, indeed, different people in different cultures sometimes hold different beliefs and customs about what is right and what is wrong. But notice that I can forthrightly embrace relativism as a description, but just as quickly turn around and reject a very similar notion if that second notion is taken as a normative statement. If you decide that the existing variety of local ethical traditions means that no universal ethical rules are ever possible, then you have just made a contradiction. Gotcha. Because your statement that no universal ethical rule exists is itself a universal rule. Remember, consistency and coherence are important measures of ethical arguments, and this one fails. Now, I've stated it orally in this lecture as a negative claim, and the slide gives ethical relativism as a positive claim, but hopefully you get the idea that these two presentations have the same problem. Like many of the discussions in our textbook, this passage ends without making the claim that this seeming contradiction of ethical relativism is somehow an ironclad, eternal condemnation of the idea. No, Deborah Johnson wants to continue the dialectic. However, once this seeming contradiction about ethical relativism has been put on the table, people who want to use ethics as relative as a normative reason not to study ethics seriously are going to have to figure out why they have not made a contradiction if they want the rest of us to listen to them seriously. Using analogies is a common way to approach issues. You can hear people doing this in political debates, editorials, and talk shows all the time. But I think the technique is often misused. When you use analogies in this class, please be careful. Let's say you're studying something I'll call X, and you think a different something, I'll call Y, is similar enough to X, and perhaps more familiar than X. that you think it'll be useful in our discussion about X. So you want to use notions about Y to explore our issues about X. When you do that, you're using an analogy. When you do that kind of discussion, please include the 3 steps listed here. 1. Describe the most important ways that X and Y are alike. 2. Describe the most important ways that X and Y are different. And then the 3rd, and perhaps the most important step, describe the relative importance of the similarities and differences with respect to the ethical issue you are trying to decide. Remember, for any analogy, there are always differences and similarities. In order to make a useful argument on the basis of an analogy, both the similarities and differences have to be accounted for. Well, we've talked about doing ethics and we've talked about analogies. So let's use some analogies to review what ethics is, or at least should be. Ethics is something like having a conversation, since it can be engaged with people who take turns talking or writing. But this should be a particularly pointed, directed discussion. It should be a conversation with purpose and meaning. Next, the conclusion of the chapter likens doing ethics to telling and retelling a story, trying to make the story better each time. I like that analogy because it emphasizes creativity and it reminds me of good times around a campfire. But I think we should remember that doing ethics shouldn't be fictional, and we aren't really trying to be just entertaining. Instead, we're trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong when we're telling these stories. Finally, a dialectic could be thought of as a journey taken with a group of scholars. Unlike most journeys, however, a true ethical seeker of truth may not know where that journey will end up, because that scholar wants to be open to new ideas and learning from others. And the idea of an ethical scholar is similar in my mind to an ethical practitioner who wants to be a better IT professional. Some people think that ethics is about figuring out who's at fault when something goes wrong. That may be part of what ethics is about, but I think ethics is far more than that. At its best, ethics is a search for a better way. Notice that I didn't say the best way, I said a better way. In software design, we are unlikely to be able to determine that a particular design is the single perfect design for a particular situation. But we can make reasonable judgments about which of 2 or more designs is better based on criteria such as consistency, coherence, and efficiency. I think ethical analysis is much like that. We seek better, though not perfect, decisions. As we work towards that kind of progress, we can make gains, both as individuals and as groups and organizations. Soon you'll be getting your first writing assignments in this course. Here is some general advice on how to write about a computer ethics issue. First, describe the situation that you're commenting upon. In this class, you should probably include some details that describe the ins and outs of the technology involved. Second, make a substantial ethical claim about that situation. In the rest of your paper, you will justify your claim, including discussing the strongest arguments against your claim and why you think your claim stands up against those objections. Notice the internal dialectic that I'm requiring here. Put out contrasting ideas and then own what you think is the position with the strongest intellectual support. In this back and forth, in this justification, I want you to use justifications that are based on the different kinds of thinking we've had in Chapter 2 and this lecture. You can use analogies, utilitarian analysis, deontological ideas, virtue ethics, and social contract ideas. Explicitly name what technique you're using, since in this class, many of you will just be starting to use those ideas. So in your papers, I want you to be doing this on the one hand, on the other hand, that dialectic back and forth. But it's not just papers in this class where I want to see that kind of rhythm. In the discussion forums, we should see this back and forth. Hopefully, by the end of this class, making this kind of questioning and answer go on will become second nature to you. It's the kind of thing you can do in your head. Use analogies in your reasoning, but use them carefully. Before I finish this lecture, I want to point out a few useful web resources that you might want to look at in addition to our textbook and other things that you're assigned to read. Terry Bynum at the University of Southern Connecticut has a research center on computing and society with lots of resources. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a reference work that I find handy. And I edit a magazine called IEEE Technology and Society, and there are articles that are relevant to some of the things we'll discuss in this class. Fortunately for you, you can get to all the old issues of technology and society for free through UIS's library website. You've got to use our textbook, but there are other textbooks in computer ethics. Again, you might find some of these useful. Maybe you can get them by interlibrary loan. There are electronic versions of at least two of these three. I know all these authors, and I've worked with two of them. Michael Quinn has a 2010 book that's fairly popular. Herman Tavani's book is not as popular, but I think in some ways there are chapters in Tavani's book that are even better than Quinn. And I think the best title of a computer ethics book is A Gift of Fire. Sarah Bassi wrote that in 2008, and that's also available out there. Notice that all three of these books have had multiple editions, which means somebody's liked this book for a while. We're into our second week in this class, and we got 6 weeks to go after that. Keep pace, keep thinking, and keep in touch. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.